Hello and welcome back to I Completed 80s Music with me, your 80s pop archivist, the 80s mixtaper. Thought I'd give myself a flash title this week, whereas in actual fact I'm just a dude who was a kid in the 80s and ended up listening to the whole decade using Spotify and now does a pod on it. But anyway, today we get into the back half of Playlist 40 and the end of April 1982. We spent quite a few episodes in April. It's been absolutely packed with hits, but today we finally cross into May. So what do we have in store? Joan Jett makes her only appearance on this pod with a truly legendary song we've all sung at either rock concerts or even pissed up in Chicago's on a Friday night 20 years ago when we could all still hold our liquor. We then meet the curious case of the RAH band. That one's a fascinating story that sets us up for a moment in 1985. Tight Fit make one final appearance. D-Train drop a classic funk cover. The Associates Burn Bright and Burn Out. And Blondie, those pioneers of the new wave, come to an end. As always, due to copyright laws, we can't play the songs on the pod, but if you go to the episode description, you will find hyperlink playlists for both Spotify and Apple Music, so you can flip between the pod and the songs. Plus, there's a full track listing there as well. So, without further ado, let's not stand on ceremony today. Let's get back to the music. To call this first act a one-hit wonder would be doing them a massive disservice, because in fact, they were always big in America, but just had one shiny hit on both sides of the Atlantic. A hit that would be sung in full voice by rockers and retro club goers alike. We slip back a year to 1981, and rock and roll is looking for a new queen. Not the kind who wears a crown, but the kind who wears a black leather jacket and a sneer that could divert a bullet. In the UK, she is often remembered as a one-hit wonder. In the US, she was a revolution. This is the story of a girl who was told she couldn't play electric guitar because girls don't play rock and roll, and her 7-week reign at the top of the charts with a song she found on a grainy British television screen. This is Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, and this is I Love Rock and Roll. Track 8, Playlist 40. Surely each and every one of us have belted that song out. Stood on a sticky dance floor somewhere in a club in our 20s after having too many sambucas, probably back in the noughties. I digress. Born Joan Marie Larkin in a suburb of Philadelphia on September the 22nd, 1958, Jett was a self-professed tomboy who found her salvation in 3 chords. At age 13, she received her first guitar for Christmas, a Gibson Melody Maker. Her time with a guitar teacher was famously short. He tried to force-feed her folk songs, but she wanted to rock. When her family moved to California, the glam rock scene at Rodney Bingenheimer's English disco became her classroom. Shortly after her parents divorced, she changed her name to Joan Jett, a moniker she felt had a rock star sound. Though she once claimed Jett was her mother's maiden name, she later admitted this was a fabrication for her persona. At just 15, she co-founded the Runaways in 1975 with drummer Sandy West. They were a pioneering, all-female teenage rock band that faced a wall of scepticism. During a 1976 UK tour, Jett saw a band called the Arrows performing I Love Rock and Roll on a weekly ITV series. She was instantly hooked, but her bandmates in the Runaways passed on the song. After the group split in 1979, Jett was famously rejected by 23 record labels. Undeterred, she and producer Kenny Laguna founded Blackheart Records, selling copies of her debut album from the back of Laguna's car. The version of the song that made her a legend wasn't her first attempt. In 1979, she recorded it as a B-side in London with Steve Jones and Paul Cook of the Sex Pistols. But the definitive hit arrived in 1981 with her newly formed band the Blackhearts. In the US, it was a monster, holding number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 7 weeks starting March the 20th, 1982. In the UK, it reached number 4 and remains her only top 10 single there, cementing her legacy as a one-hit wonder for British audiences, despite a US career with multiple top 10 hits like Crimson and Clover and I Hate Myself for Loving You. The song itself was written by Alan Merrill and Jake Hooker as a response to the Rolling Stones' It's Only Rock and Roll. Jett's version flipped the narrative. Instead of a man pursuing a girl, she pursues the boy by the record machine. The iconic music video was famously converted to black and white because Jett disliked how her red leather jumpsuit looked in colour. Beyond her own hits, Jett became a godmother of sorts to the scene, producing the first album for the Germs and later working with Bikini Kill. She proved independence was the ultimate power move, eventually earning a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015. Joan Jett lived rock and roll and still does, turning a statement of musical preference into a rallying cry for every kid with something to prove. In the early 1990s, she continued to champion female musicians by collaborating with artists like Kathleen Hanna, and even branched into acting, appearing in a film Light of Day with Michael J. Fox. Jett has also been a dedicated activist, supporting animal rights as a long-time vegetarian and advocating for the LGBTQ+ community. Today, she remains a fierce symbol of authenticity and defiance, still performing and proving that her bad reputation was the best thing she ever had. Whether she's on stage in New York or being honoured with a signature Gibson Melody Maker, she is, and always will be, the undisputed queen of rock and roll. For track 9, occasionally I'll introduce a band with a slightly odd record to set them up for a song a few years down the line. This is one of those occasions. You know that feeling when you look at the liner notes of the most expensive, most expansive records of the 1970s, and you keep seeing the same name. You see it next to the Beatles on Let It Be. You see it on James Taylor's debut. You see it on Bee Gees records and Diana Ross sessions. That name is Richard Anthony Hewson. He was the guy you called when you needed a 30-piece string section to sound like a physical manifestation of heartbreak. He was a classically trained architect of sound from the Guildhall School of Music, a man who spent his days translating the whims of rock stars into orchestral notation. But by the late 1970s, Richard Hewson decided he didn't want to be the guy behind the guy anymore. He wanted to be the guy in the studio, surrounded by the newest, strangest toys the synthesizer resolution could provide. He became the RAH band, an acronym for his own name, and he became a pioneer of bedroom pop before that was even a marketing category. He wasn't a band, he was a technician playing every instrument himself, looking for a way to bridge the gap between a disco floor and the rings of Saturn. In 1982, he hit a specific shimmering peak. He brought in his wife Liz to provide a vocal that felt like a breeze through a digital meadow. This is a song about atmosphere, and it could well be also a song about having a bit of How's Your Father, if you know what I mean, when you read the lyrics. It's about a very specific type of British electronic soul. This is Perfumed Garden. Track 9, press play now. Richard Anthony Hewson was, by 1982, already a legend of the background. If you've ever felt that emotional swell of a string section on a record from the late 1960s or the 1970s, there is a very high probability you were listening to the work of Hewson. Born in Stockton-on-Tees in 1943, Hewson was the secret weapon for the biggest names in the galaxy. He arranged the strings on The Long and Winding Road and I, Me, Mine. He helped James Taylor find that Carolina in My Mind feeling. He worked with Supertramp and Fleetwood Mac. He even did the orchestral arrangements for Paul McCartney's Thrillington album. But Richard Hewson was tired of just getting a flat fee for making other people sound like geniuses. In 1977, he founded the RAH band, an acronym for his own initials, RAH. And he did it as a bedroom band. He played every instrument himself. He recorded The Crunch, a stomping, futuristic instrumental that sounded like a robot at a glam rock club. It didn't use a single synthesizer, it was all guitar and keyboards through pedal effects. It went to number 6 in the UK, and suddenly the man behind the curtain was on top of the pops. But the crunch was a gimmick. The RAH band's real soul revealed itself in the early 1980s as Hewson leaned into the jazz funk movement. This brings us to 1982 and Perfumed Garden. Released in April on the KR and TMT labels, it was a pivotal moment. It was his first real attempt at a specific type of audiovisual songwriting. The song features the vocals of his wife Liz Hewson, often credited as Dizzy Lizzy, whose voice would become the emotional core of their biggest hit. Perfume Garden peaked at number 45 on the official UK singles chart in May 1982. It wasn't the biggest smash, but it was a cult classic. It occupies a space between the disco of the previous decade and the synth pop of the one which was starting. It's got these Brazilian influences mixed with blissful Brit funk vibes. The 12-inch version included the track Funk Me Down to Rio 82 on the B-side, cementing that Latin funk connection Hewson was obsessed with. We're starting here because it sets the stage. It's also a pretty good song. It introduces the DIY aesthetic and the collaboration with Liz. It is the sophisticated older sibling to the song we will eventually talk about, the one involving a 100-year war with Mars and a long-distance phone call across the galaxy. But before we get to Clouds Across the Moon in 1985, we have to understand the garden where it all grew. For track 10, in the early 1980s, the British pop landscape was an ecosystem of manufactured miracles and high-concept camp. This is a world where a group called Tight Fit could dominate the airwaves by dressing like jungle-dwelling fantasies and singing songs that felt, and as it turned out were, as ancient as the savannah. When we last met this trio in 1982, they had just secured a 3-week stay at the summit of the UK singles chart with their cover of The Lion Sleeps Tonight back in episode 35.5. It was a moment of sheer unadulterated chart pop brilliance. Steve Grant as the muscular Tarzan figure, flanked by the backup singer turned front women Denise Gingell and Julie Harris. But the industry is a hungry beast, and a one-hit wonder is just a footnote in a diary, albeit an entirely memorable one. To survive, they needed a follow-up that wasn't just a novelty, but a statement of pop intent. They found it in a song that had already failed to win a ticket to the grandest stage of them all, the Eurovision Song Contest. Let's listen to Fantasy Island. Press play now. I could have ended the Tight Fit story on The Lion Sleeps Tonight, but you know what? I like this song. Fantasy Island is a song that wears its influences on its sleeve. Specifically, it wears them like a sequin jumpsuit discarded by ABBA. I mean, you can really hear the ABBA in this track. Released in April 1982, the track was actually a cover of a Dutch group called the Millionaires, who had performed it during the Dutch national selection heats for Eurovision earlier that year. While the original only managed second place in the Dutch selection, the producers at Jive Records, specifically Tim Fries-Green, who would later become the unofficial fourth member of the experimental band Talk Talk, saw something in it. Under Fries-Green's direction at Battery Studios in London, the song was transformed into a shimmering ABBA-light anthem. It was a high-stakes pivot. While The Lion Sleeps Tonight featured session singer Roy Ward on the actual record, Fantasy Island was the first time the public-facing trio, Grant, Gingell and Harris, were the ones actually singing on the studio track. The gamble paid off handsomely, as the single rocketed to number 5 on the UK singles chart in May 1982. The story behind the scenes, however, was less of a tropical paradise. Despite the island rhythms and decadent piano riffs, the band members were essentially employees rather than stars. They were being paid what was described as a paltry wage, and they were allegedly receiving no royalties from their massive hits. By the time their third single, Secret Heart, stalled at number 41 in August 1982, the cracks were wide open. Harris and Gingell both departed the group shortly after the release of their self-titled album that year, leading to a hasty replacement by Vicky Pemberton and Carol Stevens. But this new lineup failed to find the same magic, and the Tight Fit era effectively ended with a fizzle in 1983 after a final, uncharted cover of Love the One You're With. The members moved on to various lives. Harris became a qualified chef and mother of 3, while Ginger married the legendary producer Pete Waterman. Steve Grant returned to his roots in musical theatre, appearing in West End staples like Miss Saigon before eye health issues led him back to studio work. But pop culture is circular. In 2010, the original trio, Grant, Ginger and Harris, reunited to reclaim their name and their songs, even releasing an updated version of Fantasy Island for the dance clubs. Tight Fit was always a creation of its time, a vivid, leopard print flash in the pan that somehow managed to distill the essence of early 80s escapism into 3.5 minutes of pure pop and one monster hit indelibly burned into every 80s child's mind in The Lion Sleeps Tonight. For our next song, I'm not the biggest fan of covering covers, but sometimes they're essential to the story. A lot of ska in the 1980s were covers after all, but this next one is just a damn fine cover. The last time we checked in with the Brooklyn-born force of nature, known as James D. Train Williams and the synthesizer wizard Hubert Eves III in episode 36. It was 1982, and they were essentially the kings of the New York club scene. Their debut single, You're the One for Me, had topped the charts and redefined them, trading the orchestral excesses of disco for something lean, robotic, and undeniably funky. But the question for any duo that strikes gold with their first swing is always, what do you do for the encore? For D-Train, the answer wasn't necessary to write another You're the One for Me. It was to take a standard, a piece of the Great American Songbook, and drag it, kicking and screaming, into the era of the Prophet 5 synthesizer. Next up, Walk On By, track 11, playlist 40. D-Train's debut album, originally just titled D-Train, was doing so well that Prelude Records eventually renamed it You're the One for Me, just so people could find it in the record bins. It was a powerhouse of a record that bridged the gap between the fading disco lights and the rising tide of house music. The choice to cover Walk On By was a bold one. Written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, the song was already legendary, immortalised by Dionne Warwick in 1964 and famously reimagined as a sprawling psychedelic soul epic by Isaac Hayes in 1969. If somehow you've never heard the Warwick version, I urge you to seek it out once this pod has finished. But James Williams and Hubert Eves III didn't want the orchestral polish of Warwick or the cinematic gloom of Hayes. They wanted electro boogie. Hubert Eves was the architect of this sound. Having cut his teeth with the band Matume in the 70s, he was the master of the big fat original analogue Prophet sound. On Walk On By, he replaced the signature Bacharach horns with stabbing futuristic synths. Meanwhile, James D. Train Williams, who got his nickname from his days as a powerhouse football player in high school, delivered a vocal performance that was pure gospel grit. The single was released in 1982 as the third major cut from the debut album, following the massive success of Keep On. While it didn't quite reach the chart-topping heights of their debut, it was a substantial hit in its own right, peaking at number 42 on the Billboard Hot R&B Songs chart and 45 on the Dance Club Play chart. In the UK, it climbed to number 44 on the singles chart, solidifying the duo's international reputation. What makes the D-Train version of Walk On By so essential isn't just the vocal, it's the D-Train dub. Remixed by the legendary Francois Kevorkian, the dub version became a staple at iconic New York clubs like the Paradise Garage and David Mancuso's The Loft. It featured aggressive percussion and minimal vocals, allowing Eve's synthesizer textures to take centre stage. By 1983, the duo moved on to their second album, Music, which featured the gospel-infused title track. Another dancefloor anthem that nearly equalled their debut success, a song we'll hear on this pod. But for now, we leave D-Train yet again kicking heels on the dance floor. For our penultimate track on Playlist 40, we say goodbye to one of the absolute powerhouses of 1980. One of the new wave who paved the way for everything else which was to come. Blondie. We last met Blondie all the way back in episode 18.5. Yes, it really has been that long already. In the neon slick dawn of 1981, when Rapture was rewriting the rules of the Billboard charts, and Debbie Harry was officially the coolest person on the planet. But as 1982 rolled around, that high-gloss veneer was starting to crack. The band was exhausted, the money was disappearing into a black hole of mismanagement, and the internal friction was loud enough to drown out the drums. This is our last visit with them for a long time, unless of course I continue into the 1990s. Now there's a threat. And the song we're looking at today is the sound of a band trying to dance through the collapse. This is Island of Lost Souls, track 12. It is May 1982, and Blondie has just released their 6th studio album, The Hunter. If their previous record, Auto-American, was a genre-hopping experiment that somehow worked, The Hunter felt like the moment the experiment went sideways. It's a loose concept album about hunting and searching, but mostly it's the sound of a group of people who are barely speaking to each other. Island of Lost Souls was the lead single, and it's a weird one. It's a full-on dive into calypso music. This wasn't just the band messing around with the synthesizer. They brought in a horn section featuring 3 trumpet players and 2 saxophonists to get that breezy, tropical feel. Drummer Clem Burke even stepped away from his usual kit to play the steel pan, and Chris Stein added a cuica, a Brazilian friction drum, into the bridge. The lyrics, written by Debbie Harry and Chris Stein, are playful but oddly detached. You've got lines about buccaneers and trucks in gear, delivered with a tropical flair that felt worlds away from the gritty New York streets where they started. Innovation works until it doesn't. To film the video, the band headed to the subtropical Tresco Abbey Gardens in the Isles of Scilly, about 28 miles off the coast of Cornwall. Celebrity photographer Brian Harris went with them, capturing the band in white monk robes and fish masks while they sailed on a Cornish gig boat. It looks like a dream, but the reality was much colder. Debbie Harry genuinely looks like she's shivering in the video. When the song hit the airwaves, the response was okay. It reached number 11 in the UK, but in the US, it stalled at number 37 on the Billboard Hot 100. That would be a hit for any other group, but not Blondie's usual gaudy numbers. It was their final top 40 hit in America. The reviews weren't kind either. Some critics dismissed it as cruise boat music or a commercial disappointment. But the real trouble was happening behind the scenes. During the 1982 Tracks Across America tour, Chris Stein was wasting away. He was emaciated, down to about 110 pounds, and could barely swallow food. For months, the doctors were baffled. They thought it might be cancer or AIDS. It wasn't until later that they finally gave it a name: pemphigus vulgaris, a rare and potentially fatal autoimmune disease that causes severe blistering of the skin and mucous membranes. By November 1982, Blondie officially called it quits. The music took a back seat, and Debbie Harry parked her own solo career to become Stein's full-time carer. Harry will go on to have a successful solo career in the 80s, and we'll hear those songs on the pod. But Blondie wouldn't release another note of new music together for 17 years, until they made a massive comeback with Maria in 1999. We say goodbye to them now. We end this episode with a very special milestone. This, folks, is track 500. And at this juncture, I need to confess something. I'm great at ideas and I'm great at starting things, but I've always been lousy at continuing them or finishing them. To be honest, this podcast should have probably ended about a year ago by my previous efforts. But I love it. I absolutely love it. I love the music. I love the research. The stories are so fascinating. And I do it for that love. The podcast makes almost no money, $10 a year. I do it for two reasons. One, I'm in love with the subject matter, and two, I do it for the people who listen. And if you've been on this journey from the start, thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. My goodness, we've got a long way to go yet. But if you've stuck with me through 500 witterings about songs, I can't express my gratitude more. Thank you. So here's to the next 500. Anyway, before the room gets any more dusty, the last time we spoke about the Associates, it was mid-February 1982, and the world was just starting to tremble under the weight of Party Fears 2. That song was a top 10 seismic event, a high drama invasion of the British charts that turned two boys from Dundee, the operatic mercurial Billy Mackenzie and the multi-instrumentalist architect Alan Rankin, into musical heir apparents on top of the pops. But if Party Fears 2 was the arrival, our next song is the acceleration. It's the sound of a band not just entering the palace of pop, but deciding to rearrange all the furniture while setting it on fire. It is Club Country, track 13, our final song on Playlist 40. So, Club Country, released in April 1982, it's the second single from the album Sulk, which many critics still consider the high watermark of art pop. If you listen to the lyrics, it's not exactly a celebration of nightlife. Mackenzie is singing "Alive and kicking at the country club. We're all a bit sickening at the country club. A drive from nowhere leaves you in the cold. Refrigeration keeps you young, I'm told." It was his take on the hollow designer label exhaustion of the early 80s scene. The production, handled by the band alongside Mike Hedges, was a masterclass in how not to spend your advance. As mentioned the last time we met them, legend has it they blew half their £60,000 recording advance before they even finished the record, spending it on luxury hotels and high-end food for Billy's beloved Whippets. That extravagance is baked into the track. It's a galloping disco-influenced nightmare with layers of synths that sound like they're being played in a cathedral. But here's the thing about the Associates. That fire that made them brilliant also consumed them. Sulk hit number 10 in the UK and stayed in the charts for 20 weeks. They were being courted by industry giants like Seymour Stein of Sire Records, who offered a massive $600,000 deal to take them to America. But Mackenzie, ever the contrarian, pulled the plug. He cancelled the UK tour 24 hours before it was meant to start and refused to go to the US. He hated the idea of the circus. By October 1982, just 4 months after Salt was released, Alan Rankin walked away. He couldn't deal with the volatility anymore. Mackenzie kept the name, releasing albums like Perhaps and Wild and Lonely, but the magic of that original duo was gone. The sadder truth is this. The story ends in a garden shed in Ochterhouse, Angus, Scotland. In January 1997, Billy Mackenzie took his own life at the age of 39, shortly after the death of his mother. He left behind a voice that even David Bowie and Bjork admired. A voice that never quite found its place in a world that wanted him to be something, while he just wanted to be free. This was the end of the Associates, a band that for one brief summer in 1982 made some of the most beautiful pop music you'll ever hear. So my friends, that was Playlist 40 and our 500th track. But well, you've made it this far. I mean, you're committed now. And we've still got the rest of the 80s to go. So let's take the next step into Playlist 41 and May 1982. Next week, we meet the German winner of the 1982 Eurovision Song Contest. The wonderful thing that as Kid Creole makes his return, we introduce Charlene and her introspective hit, which sounds like a modern LinkedIn post. And then, for those who remember, back in 1981, we did a memory off comparing the Elaine Page version with the Bab Streisand version. Well, next week, we have a Our Lips Are Sealed off. as we meet the Go-Go's and then compare it to the band who actually wrote the track, Funboy 3. And then we end the episode with two absolute titans, but I'm not going to reveal who they are just yet. It's going to be quite the episode. If you're enjoying the pod and want more, if you can find your way to buying me a coffee, the link to my Buy Me a Coffee page is in the episode description. And do remember to hit subscribe and make sure you get the next episode. So come back next week as we step into song 501 and more 80s madness. Only here on I Completed 80s Music. Take care.